Poppy was introduced to Beatrice Landau through her brother, a low-level runner for the same family Poppy now worked for. Wilhelm, the brother, was a troublemaker, a screw-up. He loved his family, but he was drawn to violence like a halibut to water. Poppy was in a very satisfactory position at that moment. He wasn't dating, was focused on work, a new trucking business he purchased through the Zeffirelli family with a silent partner. He had 6 trucks running goods through Detroit. Most came his way from the East Coast connections, the Jersey Boys, Atlantic City, Baltimore. Everything from fine goods to weaponry. Nobody wanted to talk about war, but Poppy knew it was coming. He'd traveled to Europe 3 times during the past year. There were things he saw coming down the pipeline ahead of many others in his business. That knowledge put Michael Ashner in a position of strength and influence. He'd just turned 30 that December. Beatrice Landau was 20 years old. She was from Austria and now lived in Detroit with her mother and brother. She was quiet and lovely, with dark hair, ebony eyes, and a heart-shaped face. They met in the last hurrah of 1939 when Wilhelm dragged his reluctant sister to a New Year's party downtown at the Pontchartrain. Beatrice and Poppy courted for a year, 6 months casually and 6 more seriously. She fell in love with his smile and his gentlemanly ways. Poppy was mature, not too tall, very dapper, and had a solemn air, a seriousness about him. He was never insensitive or crass. He didn't crack the cheap jokes that so many other dance hall boys did. Poppy was on his best behavior with her and with her mother. Beatrice accepted his proposal the following January. She knew that, like her brother, some of his business dealings were illegal, but she never asked about it. It made her uncomfortable and sad. She believed he was forced to make poor choices in his young life, but that he yearned for better. They were married that September. They enjoyed 3 months of wedded bliss. The newlyweds went to Mackinac Island for an extended honeymoon that fall. They came home to settle into a new apartment on the top floor of the Palms Apartments. The Ashners entertained for friends at Thanksgiving. They were planning a big Hanukkah celebration the following month with a belated wedding reception, but in early December came the attack at Pearl Harbor. They stressed for 3 months about Michael getting drafted and sent off to war. Instead, he was arrested on a 2-year-old charge of extortion and sent in early summer to the state penitentiary. He told Beatrice that he did nothing wrong, but nonetheless, he had to take the fall. It was a power play, he reasoned with her. Fallout from the break with the Livornos a couple years earlier. Happens all the time, he insisted. The Zeffirellis agreed to this. We do our time, and when we're out, we get rewarded for our loyalty. Despite his justifications, Beatrice did not understand. She felt hoodwinked and very, very angry. Her whole demeanor changed overnight toward him. Poppy was sentenced to 36 months in Jackson. She moved in with her mother. He got out early, a little more than 10 months later, and he promised to make up that time and the disappointment to her. He did, tenfold. He started by buying her a mink coat, and even bought his mother-in-law one, too. He gave Beatrice a beautiful pearl ring, big as her knuckle, and then he got her pregnant. The first miscarriage happened late at night, April 1944. She was in a daze, dreaming about her late father, and woke to horrible cramping. She tiptoed into the bathroom and blood began gushing out of her. Beatrice was 5 months along. Her panic was so great that she couldn't even scream. She crawled into the bathtub and began to moan. Finally, Poppy woke and heard her. He scooped her up and rushed her to the hospital, where they performed an emergency D&C. She had another miscarriage less than a year later. This time she was 3 months pregnant and began to cramp while at the salon getting a manicure. She quietly drove herself home and called for her mother, who was living up the road. Then they had their little girl in March of 1946. The war was over, business was steady, and they were living in a new home. They named the baby Vivian, for Vienna, although this was Poppy's idea, not Beatrice's. Vivian resembled both of her parents. Glossy dark hair, creamy skin, and a calm, knowing smile. One muggy Sunday in July, Beatrice woke late at night with a start. She realized the baby was too quiet. She bolted into the nursery and found Vivian already still in blue. This time Beatrice screamed. She grabbed the baby and began rubbing her little chest with her clenched knuckles, dropping to her knees in agony. She blamed Poppy. She'd asked to keep the crib in their room, and he insisted on having a proper nursery. She wanted to have a nurse at night, and he didn't like the idea of hired help sleeping inside their house. It was bad enough, in his opinion, that he posted men outside their home for protection during the most volatile of times. He didn't want some interloper watching their daughter. Vivian was their responsibility. They never knew what caused the baby's death. Perhaps her lungs weren't fully formed. That was all the doctor said. He advised Michael to get his wife knocked up again as quick as can be. But Beatrice was afraid to get pregnant again, and increasingly more frightened of the night. She took to leaving a light on. She suffered night terrors about her father, who died during a transatlantic trip. She was deeply ashamed of these nightmares, and had moments when she really doubted her sanity. She couldn't tell anyone, and received no help until she was in her 50s, and at that time, it was simply diagnosed as menopause and hysteria. She was treated with pills. Poppy was supporting Judith, and she moved in with him following the baby's death. Her influence upon her daughter was not always positive. Those early years of their marriage were so difficult. He was patient and had known hardship, but he didn't understand depression, and Beatrice was often swept up in moments of inner rage. The war years were dreadful for her, in a way that was different from Poppy. Her brother was in deep with gambling and working for a weapons dealer. Her beloved father was long dead, and her mother no solace to her, and yet they often clung to one another like barnacles. Rather than feeling grateful for the opportunity she'd been so fortunate to receive when she fled pre-war Europe, Beatrice was haunted by all that was lost. She hadn't believed the stories that her husband told her about what was happening to European Jews. She read that many were imprisoned and that some died, but when he told her about his travels into Poland and Hungary, she thought he was being melodramatic. The night she first saw the photographs of concentration camp victims in Life magazine, she howled and tried to climb under the bed. The skeletal living, the piles of dead. It took a long time to calm her that night. Poppy was confused. He knew this was happening. How did she not? She had in fact been there in Europe before the war. She seemed stuck in a romanticized version of the 1930s. In her ivory empire-waisted dresses, demure hats, and pale makeup. The death of her daughter settled into her eyes, turning them harsh and unforgiving. She took her anger out upon her husband. Having Judith by her side only fueled Beatrice's ire and her secretiveness. That mother of his drove Poppy out of his wits. Big woman, sharp-tongued. Poppy never asked anything of her. He did all the cooking in the household and gallantly put up with the older woman, waited on her, bought her nice things, even asked some of his most trusted men to teach her how to drive. He started to immerse himself in his work. Home was not always the most pleasant place to be. He never knew quite what would set either woman off. He sold his portion of the trucking business and bought a commercial laundry and uniform service. Wound up running it for the next 19 years. Did some work with the vending companies as well. He mostly dealt with the hotels all around the Detroit area. He met people. He lunched. His closest friend owned the Central Community Center where Joe Louis trained. He attended synagogue every Saturday. Beatrice discovered she was pregnant again that spring. They waited on pins and needles, taking things so cautiously. They knew this baby was a gamble. But Solomon Ashner was born healthy and fit in late 47. They had their son, and what a wondrous and curious baby he was. Solomon changed everything, or should have. Beatrice softened, but only to her son. Judith was sent packing across town after the baby came home.